People out there think that the moment you start achieving some success that things are going to get easier. It gets worse. There are more opportunities and therefore your structure gets disrupted. More email, more texts come in, more amazing possible relationships and places to eat and things to do. It actually starts to undermine the whole process if you're not careful. I have a list and now I make it every day because when I just put it next to me and I didn't write it out, it didn't work, but it literally starts dog walk number 1, get sun, really basic stuff, get sunlight. Then I do a 90-minute work block, which means I use the program Freedom on the computer, no internet, no phone. I turn off the phone, I put it in my car. Sometimes it's really bad. I mean, the phone is such a pull. Ask me for some code to get into something and then I think I need the phone. Next thing I'm doing something else. 90-minute work block. But what's beautiful is that the nervous system has this feature to it where when we take the chaos of choice and we restrict ourselves to one of those choices, you get a neurochemical payoff. And it comes in the form of dopamine.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more, and you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Andrew Huberman, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy.
There's something about activities that are forced restriction to one particular focus, right? So I'm going to write for 90 minutes, or I'm going to think for 90 minutes, or I'm just going to walk the dog. I live in an area now where I don't get reception on my dog walks. And at first it was excruciating. I love it now. It's like I just walk the dog. And there's mornings where I have a bulldog. He does not like to walk. So I'm like, I got to get back, and I'm frustrated. And I know, and it's hilarious, right? Because I notice myself and the way that my tripwire to agitation is so slight. I'm like one of these people I can just, in a second, I'm aggravated because it's not happening as quickly. And so I've learned to make the whole walk a process of me just like recognizing these features of myself. And my bulldog Costello just plods along. He could care less, right? So the walk is only about walking the dog. And the email, if it's email, is only about checking email. Right. And there's something valuable to this. And I think the brain loves this when we give it this. And the brain, unfortunately, is also happy to just take a smorgasbord of pseudo-random thoughts and actions all day, every day. But there's something so deeply satisfying about focus. And I think we could all benefit from doing more of that. It's just so hard to do. And I'm not an anti-phone guy. I'm from Silicon Valley. I use the phone. I'm addicted to my phone. I admit it. I'm addicted to my phone. But I'm trying really hard to cultivate a different relationship to it. Because I think that now that it's 2021, I think looking back, phones, we've had them for about 10 years. There are so many examples of ways in which they erode our best relationship to life. So many ways. That I don't think we should get rid of them, but I think we really need to start being conscious of the ways in which they are eroding our productivity, our creativity, our relationships. And I don't have any obvious answers to this. I just have tools that I use and that I've found to be of benefit. But I think in the next 5 years, we are going to see a shift toward people really moving away from phones in as much as we use them now.
Rule number 2, use stress to grow.
I have really tried to adopt this idea that when it's inevitable, and it will inevitably arrive, that stress grows us, that it really sharpens decision-making. It really sharpens decision-making. And, if you have a very stressful event and then you recover from it, the worst thing to do is just go and keep going. You need to take some time and reflect about what led into that. So I think I'm very good at leveraging fear into positive change. If I really think about most of the major shifts in my life, it was, I'm scared as hell to remain in this situation, and I'm very good at broadcasting fear into my future. If I've ever been in a bad relationship, it was clearly if I stayed in, it couldn't have been so bad that I felt like I had to leave. So I would broadcast and project, how horrible it would be for my future children. And I might even build that up a little bit in my system. Now, one could say, well, maybe you could have navigated it successfully. I'm better at projecting fear into my future. And that has led me to make, I think, better and better decisions over time.
Rule number 3, never say maybe.
Dopamine, as I've said, is involved in anticipation of wanting, not of having. It's involved in motivation toward the thing that you want, and it biases us towards action. Reward prediction error equals the actual amount of dopamine that's released in response to something versus minus the amount that's expected. Okay. So if you tell a kid, we might have ice cream, they hear, we're going to have ice cream, and they expect it. And if you later say, well, we're not going to have ice cream, and I said maybe, that's actually going to lead to a much bigger crash in dopamine. It's going to lead to a negative signal, a punishment signal. It's literally going to feel like pain. So kids, you can leverage this. If your parents say maybe, they're effectively telling your dopamine system absolutely. Now, adults are like this too. If we think something might happen and it doesn't happen, there's a big crash in our affect, in our emotionality. And that's because that dopamine system goes from firing about 3 to 4 times per second to about 10 or 15 times per second in the possibility that something might happen. Possibility is deeply woven into our biology of the dopamine and motivation system as a way for us, presumably in ancient times, to explore novel territories and get a sense that maybe there's water there, maybe there are mates there, maybe there's better food there, maybe there's resources there. The maybe is an important thing that in language terms, maybe means maybe. But in neurobiological terms, maybe means perhaps there's going to be the surprise of an even bigger dopamine reward. And the one thing dopamine loves more than anything else is surprise.
Rule number 4, reduce social media use.
Social media, getting dopamine hit after dopamine hit. When we first get on social media for the first time or after a long period of time, the amount of dopamine that's released we think is quite substantial. It's novel. Remember, dopamine is about novelty, surprise, and the sense that we are on some exciting track. That's what dopamine is really about. It puts us into states of readiness, anticipation, looking, seeking, etc., almost always for things outside the confines of our skin. Just to contrast it maybe for a bit more of a future discussion, serotonin does the opposite. When there's a lot of serotonin in our brain and body, typically it makes us feel satisfied, sated, and more quiescent, comfortable with what we have in our own immediate sphere and within us, right? The comfort of a good meal, the food you have. Dopamine is about go, go, go. If you look at somebody who's high on cocaine or methamphetamine, it's all about pursuit, because that's a very dopaminergic drug. You look at somebody who's taken a drug, and I'm not suggesting people do this, but it really ramps up serotonin. Let's say a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, Prozac, Zoloft, etc. The side effects of those drugs, if the dosages are too high, lack of appetite, lack of libido, kind of meh about life, then so they'll adjust the dose down. That's because those are serotonergic drugs. So in general, when we are in pursuit of things, dopamine is quite high. So now you have to remind me your question, because I've set up the dopamine serotonin parallel. Cell phones, yes. Forgive me. So the thing about cell phones is when you first get on there and you have, let's say no Wi-Fi on the flight or something, and you land, it can actually be quite stimulating. You get a lot of dopamine. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. But very quickly, when you're scrolling on social media, you're no longer getting the novelty, but you're continuing to do it and you almost don't know why you're doing it. At that point, it shifts over to something that's a bit more like an obsessive compulsive behavior, where we can define an obsessive compulsive behavior where the obsession leads to a compulsion. So the obsession is a thought, the compulsion is a behavior, but the acting out of the compulsion merely serves to increase the obsession. Right? This is very different than being obsessed with food or obsessed with cleanliness.
There's no payoff.
Right, exactly. There's no anxiety relief by carrying out the compulsion. With OCD behaviors, like scrolling social media, the dopamine quickly wanes, and then you find that you're just and we've all been there, you're scrolling, you're like, why am I doing this? This isn't that interesting. This isn't that interesting. Now, the algorithms for social media are very clever, and I don't want to demonize it. Provide a lot of my life is spent on social media now, but in the algorithms that they've incorporated function on the most powerful way to keep people doing a behavior, or an animal for that matter, is intermittent random reward, or random intermittent reward, that you don't know when you're going to hit the jackpot. So you're scrolling, and then you see something. Typically, it's very high, in nerd speak, we'd say signal to noise. So if you're reading some interesting things, this came out in the news, and then it's all of a sudden a riot, or a person that is base jumping off a building, or for people that are scrolling, looking at bodies or something like that, live bodies. Hopefully people aren't looking at the dead bodies. But look, if something's very tragic, then that has this gravitational pull. And then what happens is you start getting the system working for that next dopamine hit that you don't know when it's going to come. It's just like gambling. So I look at social media as initially being very dopaminergic, driving reward, surprise, and excitement, but very quickly transitioning to something more like OCD. And the kinds of behaviors where it looks, if we were to look at ourselves through the lens of an experiment, like we would an animal experiment, we'd think that animal is sick. If you saw an animal digging in the corner, looking for a bone, the dog is looking, you'd think that's really sad. That's us, right? That's us. I'm pointing at myself intentionally. That's us. So we have to learn to self-regulate the amount of time, but that doesn't have to be a process of, scruffing ourselves and saying, don't do it. Think about it in terms of the positive. The more time away from something, the more positively reinforcing it will be when you return.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, become more focused.
There are behavioral tools that you can use to enhance focus. Things like staring at a particular visual target at the same distance at which you're going to perform some work and doing that for 30 to 60 seconds. Narrowing in a very deliberate way your visual field, and then moving into a focused work bout. That behavioral practice of narrowing your visual aperture will increase the amount of acetylcholine transmission in particular neural circuits that will then make it easier to focus. How do we know that? Well, I covered in that episode some of the peer-reviewed studies that relate to protocols that are now actively being deployed in schools in China and elsewhere, where kids are doing deliberate visual focus exercises in order to increase their mental focus. And while they're not doing microdialysis or brain imaging on those kids in real time, the cognitive effects and indeed the performance effects in terms of academic ability and output are pretty impressive. So acetylcholine increases focus. We talked about some dietary and some supplementation-based ways to improve acetylcholine, or I should say increase acetylcholine. And that does in fact lead to increases in one's ability to focus. This is why a lot of the prescription drugs for the treatment of Alzheimer's, age-related cognitive decline, and indeed even some of the drugs that tap into treatments for ADHD also involve the acetylcholine system. So there's nothing surprising or heretical here, but it is important to point out that your behavioral ability to focus is also related to your ability to access and deploy acetylcholine. So never do we want purely pharmacologic treatments to be the only way that people are increasing a given neuromodulator. I always say behaviors first, then nutrition, then supplementation, and then if there's a need, certainly a clinical need, then prescription drugs, et cetera, of course, administered through a physician.
Rule number 6, leverage pleasure and pain.
And nowadays, there's a ton of interest in social media and in video games. And there have been some measurements of the amount of dopamine released. Video games, especially video games that have a very high update speed, where there's novel territory all the time. Novelty is a big stimulus of dopamine. Those can release dopamine somewhere between nicotine and cocaine. So very high levels of dopamine release. Social media is an interesting one because the amount of dopamine that's released in response to logging onto social media initially could be quite high, but it seems likely that there's a taper in the amount of dopamine, and yet people still get addicted. So why? Why is it that we can get addicted to things that fail to elicit the same massive amount of pleasure that they initially did? Being addicted to something isn't just about the fact that it feels so good that you want to do it over and over again. And that's because of this pleasure-pain balance that underlies motivation. So let's look a little bit closer at the pleasure-pain balance, because therein lies the tools for you to be able to control motivation toward healthy things and avoid motivated behaviors towards things that are destructive for you. There are a lot of reasons why people try novel behaviors, whether or not those are drugs or whether or not those are adventure, thrill-seeking things, or they seek out new partners, or, they take a new class. As you'll notice, I'm not placing any judgment or value on these different behaviors. Although I think it's fair to point out that for most people, addictive drugs like cocaine and amphetamine are very destructive. Actually, we know that about 15 to 20% of people have a genetic bias towards addiction that, you sometimes hear that the first time that you use a drug, you can become addicted to it. That's actually not been shown to be true for most things and most people, but for some people that actually is true. And we'll talk a little bit later about why certain people are heavily biased toward becoming addicts on the first use of a particular drug. It's actually very interesting. It has everything to do with whether or not they were formerly addicted to something else. But in any case, the way that addiction works and the way that motivation works generally in the non-addictive setting is that when you anticipate something, a little bit of dopamine is released. And then when you reach that thing, you engage in that thing, the amount of dopamine goes up even further. But as you repeatedly pursue a behavior and you repeatedly engage with a particular thing, let's say you love running or you love chocolate. As you eat a piece of chocolate, believe it or not, it tastes good. And then there's a shift away from activation of dopamine, and there are other chemicals that are released that trigger a low-level sense of pain. Now, you might not feel it as physical pain, but the craving that you feel is both one part dopamine and one part the mirror image of dopamine, which is the pain or the craving for yet another piece of chocolate. And this is a very important and subtle feature of the dopamine system that's not often discussed. People always talk about just as pleasure. You love social media, so it gives you dopamine, and so you engage in that. You like chocolate, it releases dopamine, so you do that. But for every bit of dopamine that's released, there's another circuit in the brain that creates, you can think of it as kind of like a downward deflection in pleasure. So you engage in something you really want, and there's an increase in pleasure. And then there's without you doing anything, there's a mirror image of that, which is a downward deflection in pleasure, which we're calling pain. So for every bit of pleasure, there is a mirror image experience of pain, and they overlap in time very closely. So it's sometimes hard to sense this, but try it. The next time you eat something really delicious, you'll take a bite. It tastes delicious. And part of the experience is to want more of that thing. This is true for any pleasureful experience. Now, the diabolical part about dopamine is that because it didn't evolve in order to get you to indulge in more and more and more of something, what happens is that initially you experience an increase in pleasure, and you also experience this increase in pain shortly after or woven in with the pleasure that makes you want more of that thing. But with each subsequent time that you encounter that thing, that you pursue the chocolate, that you pursue the lover, each time the experience of dopamine release and pleasure is diminished a little bit. And the diabolical thing is that the pain response is increased a little bit. And this is best observed in the context of drug-seeking behavior. The first time someone decides to take cocaine or amphetamine, they may do it out of boredom. They may do it out of peer pressure. They may do it to relieve some internal sense. Maybe they're bored, or they're just excited. Maybe they're high in novelty seeking. There are a lot of reasons why people might try a drug. Far too many for us to get into or parse here. Maybe they don't even want to do it, but someone encourages them. They will experience a huge dopamine release, and they will feel likely very good. However, the next time they take it, it won't feel quite as good, and it won't feel even as good the third time or the next time. But the amount of pain, the amount of craving that they experience for the drug will increase over time. So much of our pursuit of pleasure is simply to reduce the pain of craving. So the next time you experience something you really like, I don't want to take you out of that experience, but it's really important that you notice this, that if there's something you really enjoy, part of that enjoyment is about the anticipation and wanting of more of that thing. And that's the pain system in action.
Rule number 7, take a break.
Learning to cultivate a life of focus. And I should say it should be the way to support that is to have components of your day of wordlessness and defocus. I do want to emphasize that because it's not about waking up and from morning till night being ultra focused, right? I don't do the make my bed first thing. I admit it. I sometimes like it happens midday. Okay. All right. I wouldn't make it in the military, but we knew that already anyway. So it's about being in recognition of where you're at and focused and dropping in deeply for certain portions of the day. But I also have a deliberate decompress time of my day, right? I take 30 minutes a day and I either take a nap or I do a yoga nidra or I just let my mind go. But that does mean not mindless scrolling, although I do some mindless scrolling too. I allow myself that. But having periods of the day where you let the mind defocus and just kind of drift in the same way that your mind drifts a bit during sleep, that is what allows you to focus. So it very intensely afterward or on a consistent basis. So it's not about being a total animal from morning till night and then just expecting to switch off the thinking and go right to sleep. It's about, for me, there are really two 90-minute blocks, one early in the day and one later in the day where I commit to doing really focused work twice a day. And I have to fight tooth and nail to create the space for those and to make sure it happens. And I fail a lot, if something gets in the way and I don't do that, I just try and get back on track as quickly as possible. I don't bring my phone. I put my phone on airplane mode when I'm training and doing any kind of physical work now because it's just too distracting.
Rule number 8, deal with your fears.
People form these associations, whether or not through experience or through indirect experience, observing others. I think public speaking is one of the greatest. Fear of dying. It's funny. It's not funny, but figure of speech. I never think about dying and being afraid of dying. I think about all the scary things that could happen while I'm living. But there are many people who are just intrinsically afraid of dying. And so that's a big one. For people that don't swim, fear of drowning. For people that swim, less so. For people that have some sort of psychiatric disorder, genuine psychiatric disorder, like obsessive compulsive disorder, which is not just obsessive compulsive personality, but obsessive compulsive disorder, fear of being discovered and the shame that they have around their obsessions and compulsions. These are true OCD is very common.
Do they all live in the same place? All of these different fears, are they all existing in the same place? So I was rattling off and I didn't answer your question to the more important point, so forgive me. The short answer is they have a final common pathway, which is increased autonomic arousal, and that is funneled through a couple what we call limbic structures, among others. So there's certainly involvement of the now famous amygdala, which means almond, is this almond-shaped structure on the two sides of the brain. There's also an area of the brain called the stria terminalis that's also involved in fear. And then the hypothalamus, this small collection of neurons just above the roof of your mouth, which is really, to me, one of the more fascinating areas of the brain, harbors neurons that create a body-wide and brain-wide response to something that the higher order areas of the brain, like the forebrain, see and perceive as dangerous, as threatening. So the short answer is yes, it all funnels through hypothalamus, amygdala, stria terminalis, and autonomic nervous system. That's a final common pathway. But in terms of the variety of different things that can stimulate fear and the ways that they can do that, that is highly contextual. So the forebrain, this real estate in the brain right behind the forehead, is incredible because it's sort of free real estate for you to customize for your life, according to what happens to you early on. So for instance, you might not be at all afraid of heights. And you say, well, why is that so? Well, maybe when you were a kid, you were one of those maniacs that doing, in the States, we call them cherry drops, the kids that could, swing on their feet and then jump off the bar. And then other kids are timidly crawling to the top of the thing, don't even want to go up the ladder to the slide. There's a ton of variation, and that variation does not exist in the kind of deeper circuitry, the final common path circuitry. It exists in the learning that we experienced early in life. One bad fall can do it. I mean, I was bitten very badly by a German Shepherd when I was a kid. Head almost got my eye, but for whatever reason, I've always liked dogs anyway. But there are other things that I've experienced that have left long-term negative imprints. So it's highly contextual, and a lot of it has to do with what happens immediately after the bad experience. This is why nowadays there's a lot of legal use of the drug ketamine
after traumas. This is all very dark stuff, unfortunately. But if you just imagine the family member that was just in a car crash and saw the driver, their loved one, impaled onto the steering column. I mean, what could be more horrible than that? Nowadays, if they come into the emergency room, they will often give them an injection of ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, to get them to dissociate from this extreme emotional state. So there are ways now to treat this, and ketamine is used clinically at later periods too.
Rule number 9, balance your emotions.
People that are always in anticipation and desire and seeking, that's wonderful for pursuing goals. However, it's terrible for enjoying life. And actually, those people are actually quite difficult to be around. There's a certain almost sociopathic element to people who are what they call hyperdopaminergic, people who are always on the dopaminergic scale, to the point where they are always pursuing goals. In fact, those people are known to be, at least in the psychological spectrum, they can be very manipulative. Dopamine and the pursuit of something doesn't necessarily have to be high energy and intense from the outside when you observe it from the outside. In fact, there are people who will manipulate in order to get what they want. This has been shown, who have high levels of dopamine release in their brain, but they've learned that a kind of passive manipulation is the best way to maneuver through a particular environment. Now, I don't want to focus too much on sociopathy, because those are kind of extreme examples, but it just goes to show that people who identify a goal and realize the series of steps that they need to take in order to achieve that goal can either do it through ethical means or non-ethical means. They can do it through active pursuit, being the kind of type A person that's always declaring their goals and going after it, posting it on Instagram, telling everybody about it, trying to recruit others. There's that phenotype. There's that kind of signature of dopamine. And then there are the people that want to get what they want, and they're doing it by always serving other people, by always taking care of everybody else's needs, by always trying to accomplish their goals, but through a mode that, at least from the outside, seems more passive or more about supporting others. Neither of these are good or bad, and that's because dopamine is a molecule. It doesn't care how you reach your goals. It only cares that you reach your goals, because the internal sensation is one, again, of mild pleasure, a little bit of pain, although more pain over time if you're not reaching those goals, and it takes you away from the here and now.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is practice waking up early.
The question is how to get enough sleep and how to make sure you get into all these different sleep states. And this is particularly important for you so-called night owls. There's a lot of controversy out there as to whether or not different so-called chronotypes exist. That is, people who just naturally or genetically want to be an early bird, wake up early and go to bed early. So these people that wake up at 4 a.m. and would be most comfortable going to bed by 7 or 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. Then there are so-called night owls, people that would feel best or tend to feel best when they go to sleep at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., even 3 a.m., and like to wake up later, 8, 9, 10, or even 11 a.m. or noon. And then, of course, most people go to sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight and wake up somewhere between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., or I suppose more typically 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. Now, whether or not real chronotypes exist or whether or not people simply select schedules for sleep and wakefulness that they like because of their social schedules or the activities they enjoy. For instance, some people like to really go out. They like to go out dancing or hear music or spend time in venues that are only open late at night and don't even open until noon or after. Other people, like myself, rarely go out at night, but I like to get up early. I like to exercise. I like to see the sunrise, etc. So I don't know if I'm a morning person or an evening person. I just know the things I enjoy tend to happen in the early part of the day, and the things that I don't enjoy quite as much tend to happen late at night. Regardless of whether or not there are real genetic propensities to be a night owl or an early bird or a sort of typical person right there in the middle, it's very important that people have some control over their sleep schedule, and even more important, that people are able to get sufficient amount of REM sleep and slow wave sleep for many reasons, but including the reasons I discussed in the previous study related to metabolism. I'm very excited, therefore, about a study that came out in Sleep Medicine. This was a few years ago, but somehow I missed this one. It was published in 2019, and the title of this article is "Resetting the Late Timing of Night Owls Has a Positive Impact on Mental Health, Physical Health, and Performance." This is a study done in humans, focusing specifically on people that like to stay up late and sleep in, but who desire to be able to get up and feel alert in order to go to work or study, and they want to go to sleep a bit earlier. And so there are a lot of questions embedded in this study, in particular whether or not people can actually shift their schedule by a few hours or more. Some people out there contend that if you're a night owl, that's just going to be impossible or very, very challenging to do. Turns out it's not impossible, and it's not even that challenging to do, provided you do the right things. Just a brief overview of the study, and then I'll give you the key takeaways. It was a randomized controlled trial. It involved a number of different people, both male and female. And what they did was they used non-pharmacological, practical interventions in a real-world setting. Here I'm paraphrasing. They used targeted light exposure. They used consistent sleep-wake times. They used fixed meal times, caffeine intake, and exercise. And this is one of the reasons I love this study so much, because I've done episodes where I've talked about temperature, exercise, feeding, and most importantly, light exposure as a way to control and shift your sleep-wake cycles, your so-called circadian timing and entrainment. What did they find? Well, they found, quote, significant improvements in terms of mood, so far less depression and stress, subjectively measured, as well as improved cognitive performance that was objectively measured, so improved reaction times, improved physical grip strength, which is actually a measure not just of strength per se, but also of nervous system function, and a number of things that people could do in order to optimize their morning hours, even though they were night owls previously. What did they have people do? Well, I'm just going to list this off in sort of rapid fire succession. Then we'll provide a link to the study if you want to learn more. First of all, they told participants to try and wake up 2 to 3 hours before their typical wake up time. 2 to 3 hours. That seems brutal to me, and probably seems brutal to you if you're somebody who typically wakes up at 10 a.m. to try and get up at 8 or even 7 a.m. consistently. But they were also asked to maximize outdoor light exposure during the mornings for reasons that if you've listened to this podcast before, if you've heard me talk about before, you know that I'm constantly talking about. I'll probably go into the grave shouting, please get as much light exposure from sunlight early in the day as possible, because it sets in motion a huge number of things that are beneficial for your mental health and physical health, including dopamine production, timing melatonin production correctly, reducing cortisol peaks late in the day, et cetera, et cetera. So they asked them to get a lot of outdoor light exposure. They didn't give them a specific amount, but they said maximize outdoor light exposure during the mornings, the time before noon. And again, they had them waking up 2 to 3 hours before their habitual wake-up time. They were also told, and this is very important if you're going to shift your schedule earlier, to try and keep sleep-wake times fixed between their work days and their weekends. So not sleeping in on the weekends or not having any sleep-in days, regardless of how well they slept the night before. How fixed? Within 15 to 30 minutes of their pre-designated time. So if they were waking up at 7 o'clock one day, they set their alarm and they made sure they got out of bed at 7 o'clock every day, plus or minus 30 minutes, but never later than 7:30, never earlier than 6:30. Participants were also asked to try and go to sleep 2 to 3 hours before their habitual bedtime. So again, these are people that want to stay up late, like 11 p.m. perhaps, but even as late as 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. And now they are asked to go to sleep 2 to 3 hours before their habitual bedtime and to wake up 2 to 3 hours earlier, as I mentioned earlier. They were also told, and I love this because it fits with many of the things we've talked about on this podcast before, to try and limit light exposure during the evenings. Dim the lights or limit altogether artificial lights. A lot of reasons for that. I covered that in the Master Sleep episode. I covered that in the Optimize Health Using Light episode. You can find those at HUBERMANLab.com. They're asking them to do that here. And they ask participants to keep a regular schedule for their daily meals. Not eating on the hour consistently, at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m. exactly, but within, again, about 15 to 30 minutes, they're always eating at the same times. That was also important. And again, that's because we have these so-called food-entrained circadian clocks. When you eat, tells your body when to be alert, and when you're not eating, when to be asleep. And they were told to not drink any caffeine after 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Another theme that we've talked about on this podcast. They were also told not to take naps after 4 p.m. Naps are an interesting feature of the sleep-wake cycle. To be very brief about this and to pull from the episode that I did with world sleep expert from University of California, Berkeley, Matt Walker, naps are great for many people, but don't nap if it interferes with your nighttime sleep. And in this study, they told them, don't nap after 4 p.m. And if you are a napper, don't nap for more than 90 minutes. 10-minute naps are fine, 20-minute naps are fine, 0-minute naps are fine, but don't nap for more than 90 minutes and don't nap after 4 p.m. And to exercise during the morning. Now, this one can be a bit controversial because I know a lot of the PTs out there and a lot of the online, gym rats and people and runners too, for that matter, will say, well, according to body temperature and research, it's best to exercise in the afternoon. Look, it's better to exercise sometime as opposed to no time. But if you're focused on how to shift your schedule earlier, meaning get up earlier and go to sleep earlier, this study had people exercise in the early part of the day, certainly before 2 p.m. and ideally before noon. So again, this is a really important study because it combines a lot of different variables to arrive at this very impressive shift where people can get up 2 to 3 hours earlier and then pretty consistently and reflexively start going to bed 2 to 3 hours earlier, feeling more alert during the day. Again, improvements in cognitive performance, mood, and physical performance, grip strength, etc. Very few studies are able to or are willing to tackle so many variables and combine them in one study. This paper, I think, does a marvelous job of doing this and is incorporating things that individually each have some support for them in animal studies and previous human studies. But as far as I know, this is one of the few studies that really combines all these different features in one place. Eating times, keeping those consistent, getting maximal sunlight exposure earlier in the day, getting up at a consistent time, going to sleep at a consistent time, and on and on. It's a really marvelous study for that reason. And I think for any of you that are night owls and any of you that want to reinforce your early waking and early to bed times, and I think for most all of you who fall into that general middle category of tend to go to sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight, because that's most people, and tend to wake up sometime between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., well, maybe you want to become more of an early riser, or maybe you're going to travel, or the seasons are changing and you want to shift your time, or you have a new job, etc. Or something that's actually very common in terms of relationship struggle. You want to match your wake sleep times, or maybe you want to offset your wake sleep times from a significant other. These sorts of approaches that I described here and that are supported by the data in this paper are absolutely powerful and science supported. And I'm certain that if you were to apply them, that you would see essentially the same effects that were observed here. Exploring in humans is the extent to which people who can take on adaptive decisions, can take that adaptive behaviors, can take that stress response and kind of move the horizon in closer and just focus on, okay, I'm in a high stress regime. This is really painful. We see this in, we work on people with generalized anxiety who are trying to overcome fear of heights, and just walking across a virtual height plank can be terrifying for them. But if they can get one step in front of the other, despite high levels of anxiety, they can eventually overcome that. And so we've been looking at everything from how breathing affects the anxiety response to heart rate, pupil size, et cetera. I'd be happy to talk about all that in as much detail as you like. But I think the principle to take away is this, that the growth mindset is not about suppressing anxiety so that you're able to cruise through things with ease. That's just one part of it. It's really about trying to understand that stress response as key to your growth. It's absolutely key. And I think people that lift weights or run long distance or are involved in competitive sports, they fundamentally understand this, but even they kind of migrate away from it over time, where recovery is super important, but you need the stimulus, right? And the stimulus for growth is that stress response. And if you think about it, evolutionarily, let's say we were all living in a little clan here in the Onit offices and we didn't know anything about the outside world. We would start to kind of eventually what drove people to leave was they didn't have enough of what they needed. There's this sort of the seeking, right? So if you had enough, everything, you had enough mates, enough food, enough water, you'd be fine. But at some point there was some deprivation. And so we had to do a risk benefit analysis. And so it was really about taking that anxiety and venturing out into the unknown to find resources. Some people died and some people succeeded and they were rewarded. And with that reward came the idea that, there's something about looking out into the environment that's useful, that can allow me to have more than I have in the moment. But you can't divorce yourself from the anxiety of wondering whether or not things are going to turn out okay. You can't divorce yourself from the anxiety of strain and effort. There's just simply no way. And in fact, you weren't really designed to do it. So to kind of peel this around to a practical answer, because I often listeners and people want to know, well, what do I do with this? Is, I think the field of wellness and biohacking and high performance is great, but it lacks definition. So one thing I'd really like to see more of in these communities and in the scientific community for that matter is more careful definition. Like, what is mindfulness? Like, really, what are we really talking about? What is stress? and what are stress mitigation processes that are useful. So one thing I think is really useful is think about real-time tools versus offline tools. I believe personally that everybody, whether or not they're MMA fighter, they're into CrossFit, they're running ultras, or they're a student in class that doesn't do anything physical, whatever it is, has 4 tools. One tool to get you to mitigate your stress response in real time. So let's say the stress response hits. You need to keep it, you can't let it go too high or too low. You don't want to suppress it, but something to do that. You also probably want an offline tool that allows you to raise your ceiling on what stress feels like. I'm buds with Wim and I've known him for a long time. And I think Wim Hof breathing in particular is a useful tool for kind of shifting your perception of what stressful is. But it's an offline tool. It's not, you can do it in real time, but you're not going to start Wim Hof huffing in the middle of your rolling jujitsu because your breathing has got to be devoted to other things. So you need offline tools and real-time tools to cope with stress. And I think people need real-time tools and offline tools to bring themselves into heightened states of arousal, right? So there are times when you're actually too low on the arousal plane, and the key is to get higher up there where you can access even better levels of performance. And so I think the so-called autonomic nervous system, it's absolutely under our control. It's a total misnomer. It's just that your heart rate and your breathing are taken care of on their own. You don't need to flip the on switch. You wake up every morning and, if everything's going well, your breathing and your heart rate is going the way it should. But you absolutely have levers that you can control and move in order to shift those. And I think that there's been a lot of focus on breathing is a great tool, or, the ice bath is a great tool, but we really aren't thinking about what they're best for. And as a result of that, I don't think they'll ever evolve past where they are unless we start thinking, okay, what's the utility of breath holds? No one can tell me. So my lab is very interested in trying to figure out what the utility of breath holds is. Is it better at letting you deal with adrenaline in your system? Is it better at get carbon dioxide tolerance? For all the incredible tools that are out there, there isn't a lot of good information about systematic ways to approach it. And I don't want to peel everything down to a really reductionist approach. I'm friends with Brian McKenzie and those guys. And, and Brian's about as reductionist as you get in the breathwork community. And I love how how he loves to quantify everything. That's one of the things that initially brought us together as friends and as sort of informal collaborators. But I think that this world of biohacking needs definition. It's kind of ironic that in the weightlifting community, they've really worked things down to a kind of a fine science. Whereas in the endurance community, it's kind of like whoever you're listening to seems to be the person who knows the most. And I don't claim to know everything or the most at all. I just would like to see sharper definition on all this stuff about stress mitigation, ice baths, breathing, and so on. And of course, there could be other reasons that you're experiencing brain fog. Maybe, for people that drink alcohol the night before, maybe they had alcohol. For people that maybe they ate a meal that was too large before sleep, maybe any number of reasons, right?
Gotcha.
But getting adequate oxygenation of the brain during sleep is key. So learn to be a nasal breather. And for those of you out there that say, well, I have a deviated septum, a lot of people think they have deviated septums. The problem is they're not nasal breathing enough. The sinuses actually can learn to dilate if you nasal breathe. Exercising while nasal breathing, it will kind of depend on the sport. If you box, oftentimes there's the need to do a shh or, kind of exhale on impact type thing. So I don't think anyone should tamper with their normal breathing patterns as it relates to sport or singing or some, activity. But what I'm talking about is when you're just standing around, when you're walking down the street, any low-level activity, you're working at your desk, you should be nasal breathing and breathing regularly. That will reduce brain fog in many cases. The discovery of growth mindset is worth thinking about. So Carol's discovery was these kids that, for whatever reason, liked doing math problems, even though they knew they couldn't get the answers right. These were sure-fail problems. So it's the same kind of people that like doing puzzles. And these kids, not surprisingly, go on to do phenomenally well in a number of different areas of academic pursuit. But what's interesting about growth mindset is that it seems like there's some attachment of the reward systems of the brain to the action or the pursuit of a goal, not just achieving a goal. And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into 2 categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have, love of your dog, love of your spouse,
gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin, okay? But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal, I'm going to build my company, I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is, and you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system, to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals, is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset, in its purest form, is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining. It's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine.
For any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor. And the reward system, you start to realize, is entirely internal. No one's coming along and cramming dopamine in your ear or dripping it in your brain. It's all internal. And this starts to bring us into the kind of like discussion around mindsets. Because so my colleague Carol Dweck, who popularized this theme, growth mindset, it's again a very misunderstood concept. It's the idea that we can change, so that's built into that. But the discovery of growth mindset was of these kids that actually really enjoyed doing problem sets that they knew they couldn't get right. But for them, they would get this like dopamine release from just focusing on the problem. They liked doing puzzles they couldn't get right. It sounds crazy, but inevitably those kids are very good at puzzles and very good at math and these kinds of things. So growth mindset is, I believe, if it's sort of a neuroscience lens on growth mindset, would be that the agitation and stress that you feel at the beginning of something and when you're trying to lean into it and you can't focus is just a recognized gate. You have to pass that through that gate to get to the focus component. And then if you can reward the effort process, you really start to feel joy and low levels of excitement in the effort process. That's that buffering of adrenaline. That's that feeling like, yes, I've got a lot of adrenaline in my system, but I'm on the right path. It feels good to walk up this hill, so to speak. And when you start to bring those neural circuits together, you really start to create a whole set of circuits that are designed to be exported to any behavior you want. So if it's writing a book, great. If it's podcasting, great. If it's building a business, great. If it's building a terrific relationship, great. Then the circuits that Mother Nature has designed are incredibly generic so that we could adapt to whatever it is that we need to do. And I think the misunderstanding around how these circuits work has led to this idea that there's some secret entry point, maybe marked flow on the door, and there's a trampoline up to that door, and you just open that door and you're gonna be in it.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And anyone who's done well in any career or athletic pursuit knows this, but unfortunately, there's a kind of obsession with the idea that it's all supposed to feel good. And it does feel good, but there's a whole staircase in which it feels kind of lousy. Growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really two things. One is I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, two things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press Journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain.
With more effort, we're
every time you put in effort. So every time you make, for this, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time you, let's see, it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. Now, at some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort. And they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward and kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you anyone the feeling that you could continue, and maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk. I mean, they
They're
have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it. There was a paper published that essentially was asking why any human or animal quits at any behavior. Now, certain behaviors, like I can't lift a car, unless it's a very small car. I can't lift a car. But if we're talking about running, or we're talking about long bouts of work, the question is, why do we quit? Like, what is that? And it turns out that every time we exert effort, a certain amount of noradrenaline in the brain is released. And there's a sort of a counter in the brainstem. And at some point, enough noradrenaline is released, and it shuts down cognitive control, deliberate control over the motor circuitry, and we quit. That's it. But the thing that can restore those levels, or can sort of reset those levels lower and give us more gas, more mileage, is dopamine. And it makes perfect sense because our species had to move against very challenging things in nature and in terms of in culture at every stage of our evolution, including now. 2020 is a good example of this. And when a good example would be, if you're really slogging it out and things are miserable, just think like the worst family vacation, everything is a disaster, or a very hard physical event, and someone cracks a joke, you almost immediately feel a sense of relief. You see this in the team that wins the Super Bowl. Both teams slogged it out. You have to believe they were both at max effort the entire game. Look at the team that wins. They have extra energy. They're jumping all over the place. So it can't be physical energy. It can't be glycogen related. It's not ketone related. It's nothing in the body in that sense. It's dopamine's ability to take that level of norepinephrine and smack it back down. And so we can learn this, right? I mean, I think this is where there's real power, like in your story, or the story that I'm familiar with from your book, like the ability to push through those pain points is something that we really can export to other aspects of life because it's the same neurochemicals that are involved. So when you get to a particular location, or maybe I recall, a portion where you're feeling lousy, you're injured or you feel like you're hurt, and you can reframe it mentally and think, I'm actually still on the ladder. I'm still holding on to a rung. I know at least that much. I'm still breathing. I know that much. And the lift that we get is not some psychological pump up. It's a neurochemical thing. It's dopamine suppressing norepinephrine and saying, you're on the right path. You can keep going. It's a permission to keep going. And we grant that permission to ourselves. No one grants that permission to us. I think one of the other kind of misconceptions that we want to dissolve is this idea that external rewards can actually propel us down long paths of success and high performance. They can't.
No, that's
internal
an unsustainable
rewards.
Fuel source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend from the SEAL teams, and somebody asked us recently, we were given a talk, and somebody said, how can I make sure that I continue to self-reward and I'm not driven by these external rewards? How can I continue to have that drive? And his answer was very good. He said, give away all the external rewards. Now, not everyone can afford to do that.
It's just about you and you.
It's just you and you. And the more attached, there's a famous Stanford study done at Bing Nursery School, probably not far from where you were in the dormitory. There's a little nursery school in Escondido Village. And they did this study where they looked at kids that liked to playing during their recess. It's all recess in nursery school, but they're drawing. And they took the kids that really like to draw, and they started giving them little gold stars on their drawings. And then they like the gold stars for a kid, that's an extrinsic reward. And then they stopped doing that, and the kids stopped drawing. They associated the good feeling of doing it with the external rewards. Right. We have to be very cautious about how much of our internal dopamine we attach to external rewards if we want to continue to grow and pursue and focus and work hard. If you just want to get to some place and cash in, then fine. But most people find themselves in a pretty miserable place because their dopamine was so attached to external rewards, they need more and more of that. Well, understanding that pain and pleasure are in this really dynamic balance can also help us, which in the following way. Any pain that you feel, the longer day, the less sleep, the kind of agony that things aren't working, that power outlet doesn't work, or the internet is slow, whatever it is, the amount of pleasure that you will eventually experience is directly related, to how much pain you experience. So we know this from actually what nowadays would be considered quite barbaric and unethical experiments, where they would give people electrical shocks and they would measure their response. And then they'd say, we're going to increase it. Eventually they get to the point where a shock that was previously very painful actually evokes a sense of pleasure. Now, you couldn't do these experiments anymore. These are not the experiments I do in my lab. These are older experiments. But for instance, and this has been discussed in scientific research papers, giving somebody a 10-minute ice bath, for instance, or even a 3-minute ice bath, or a 1-minute ice bath is quite painful. But there was a study from the University of Prague, European Journal of Physiology, showed that after a painful ice bath stimulus, the amount of dopamine release goes up for 2.5 hours to 250% above baseline. And that's not because the ice bath itself evokes dopamine release. A lot of people think, oh, cold water evokes dopamine release. No, pain evokes dopamine release after the pain is over. Yesterday, I tweaked my back because I do this stupid thing every few years, the same stupid thing, and it's really painful. And then you just remember all the ways in which you can't move around. I was like standing up this morning, I'm like, and just walking is so painful. As the pain has started to dissipate, you get a little bit of a high, right? You get a little bit of a euphoria. That's dopamine, because of the degree of pain that you experienced previously predicts how much pleasure. So when you start a company down in the dregs and you're shoveling again, that's beautiful, because that means that the win that you achieve is going to be as good or greater than the one you had previously, in your case with Quest. And so we go back to this example of the person that's not motivated, that can't get off the couch, that doesn't want to do anything. Well, this is the problem. Remember the rat experiment? They are effectively the rat with no dopamine, but they can still achieve some sense of pleasure by consuming excess calories, by consuming social media. And look, I'm not judging, I do this stuff too, right? Scrolling social media. If you've ever scrolled social media and you're like, I don't even know why I'm doing this, it doesn't really feel that good. And I can remember a time where you'd see something that was just so cool, or you'd see something online. I remember this when TED Talks first came out. I was like, this is amazing. These are some, at least some of them are really smart people sharing really cool insights. And then now that there are like a gazillion TED Talks, I remember spending a winter in my office when I was a junior professor, cleaning my office finally, and binging TED Talks in the background, thinking this is a good use of my time. Pretty soon, they all sucked to me. I was like, this isn't good. So what you need to do is stop watching TED Talks for a while, wait, and then they become interesting again. And that's this pain-pleasure balance. And so for people that aren't feeling motivated, the problem is they're not motivated, but they're getting just enough or excess sustenance. So they're getting the little mild hits of opioid. It becomes an opioid system. And if you think about the opioid drugs as opposed to dopaminergic drugs make people rabid for everything. You know, drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamine make people incredibly outward directed. Right? They hardly notice anything except what they want more of, more. It's bad, because those drugs trigger so much dopamine release that they become the reward. It's very circular. Only the drug can give that much dopamine. Nothing they could pursue would give them as much dopamine as the drug itself. So there's that. And then there's the kind of opioid-like effects of constantly indulging oneself with social media or with video games or with food or with anything, to the point where it no longer evokes the motivation and craving. And this is really the new evolution of the understanding of dopamine in neuroscience, which is that dopamine itself is not the reward. It's the buildup to the reward. And the reward has more of a kind of opioid bliss-like property, which itself is not bad if it's endogenous, released from within. But when we can just sit there like the rat with no dopamine, gorging ourselves with pleasures, so to speak, what you end up with is somebody that feels really unmotivated, and those pleasures no longer work to tickle those feel-good circuits. And so there's no reason for them to go out and pursue anything. And that's a pretty dark picture. So the keys are to pursue rewards, but understand that the pursuit is actually the reward if you want to have repeated wins, okay? The celebration has to be less than the pursuit. And that's hard for some people to do. It's got to be that your celebration is slightly less dopaminergic. It can be very reflective. You can be in gratitude. Those are other neurotransmitter systems, but you don't want to be on that high as you celebrate the win. You want to be trickling out your dopamine regularly until you pursue things. That beliefs are attached to a set of rewards.
Interesting.
So what Now, the dopamine system is exceedingly powerful because dopamine is a kind of a dumb molecule. It has no brain of its own. It's just a molecule, right? It's just a chemical. But when dopamine is released in our brain, first of all, it tends to orient us towards goals in the outside environment. It's the molecule not just of reward, but of motivation. And when we release dopamine, we tend to see the world in terms of external goals. And so you can imagine now if there's a process built up inside us where our thoughts are causing dopamine release, and dopamine is shaping what we see as rewards, what we perceive as rewards, that can be wonderful or terrible depending on how that's harnessed.
So let me understand this. When we have dopamine triggered in our body, because it's attached to some type of belief, we're going to continue to say, this feels good.
That's right.
So let me keep thinking this way.
And viewing the world this way.
In this way, because it's going to keep making me feel good.
That's right.
Physically.
That's right.
Wow. Even if it's fact or not fact, scientifically true or not true.
Or harmful to other people or harmful to yourself.
If it makes you feel good, you might stick to that belief.
That's right. So a good example with dopamine is, with anytime thinking about science and neuroscience in particular, thinking at the extremes can be kind of useful. So people who are very depressed, who see no possibility in the world, if you talk to a depressed person, every response they give is going to be, but it's not going to work out.
It doesn't work for me.
They are absolutely certain that things are going to turn out bad.
And there's a benefit for having that belief,
and
right?
They're entrenched in it. They may actually be rewarding that somewhat, although typically depressed states have very low dopamine. At the opposite extreme is mania. When people are in a manic phase, dopamine is very high, we know this, and they see possibility everywhere, and there's certain things are going to work out. They will spend money they don't have, they'll create relationships they don't have time and energy for, they will overdo everything. And so somewhere in the middle is this healthy range where we realize that how we view the world is shaping the release of these chemicals. And I do believe this happens when we have positive thoughts. We get a lift. If we can get a lift from our positive thoughts, and then dopamine itself puts us in relationship with the outside world such that we view the outside world as having more possibility, that is going to put us into forward momentum. There are a lot of studies to support that. When dopamine is low, we tend to see very little possibility in the world.
So a positive thought triggers forward movement, potentially.
Yes. Yeah.
So positive thinking, which a lot of people will say, well, that's just positive thinking, it doesn't work. Some people say, well, be positive, think positive. Others say, well, it doesn't work. Well, with science, I'm hearing you say it gives you a little bit of a lift.
Absolutely. The key with positive thinking is that it has to be honest. It can't be, I've already won, I don't have an Olympic gold medal. If I could tell myself I'm going to get one tomorrow, but I just don't have the skills. So that's not going to release dopamine in my system.
How do you know it's honest if you're in a depressed state and you don't believe that you are actually better off than where you're at?
The key is to attach so one thing to understand is that dopamine release in the brain is always subjective. There's no experience that says, that has unique domain over dopamine release, that will only allow dopamine release. So if it's very subjective. So if I say to myself, I'm going to get into the process of doing something. We have a new year coming up, so there's going to be a lot of resolutions soon. It's not if you attach the dopamine release to the process of effort or goal setting itself, you'll have more energy to be in effort. And then if you can attach dopamine release to the belief that you're at least heading in the right direction, you'll have more energy to keep going in the right direction. People make the mistake of thinking that the positive thought process should be attached to the finish line. It's not about thinking you've already won. It's not about being delusional. It's about thinking that your training is going to take you to the finish line. And so it's about moving that mental horizon in more closely, and then triggering some sort of positive internal representation of what you're doing, meaning thinking positive. And this is usually where I get stopped and people say, wait, but it sounds so subjective. Tell me exactly how to do it. But here's the key point. It's supposed to be subjective.
for you, right?
Everyone needs to figure out what allows them to continue to be in forward momentum, what allows them to constrain the world of possibilities and to go after goals, and how often to self-reward. Because but the key is the self-word, because if you start only pursuing external rewards, that's when you are no longer in control of your dopamine system.
Because you're reliant on actually something physically happening in the physical world, not internal.
That's right. And let's be really, really honest and burst the bubble that I feel like should have been burst a long time ago, which is, yes, everybody, including me, it is possible that you can do everything and still fail. No one wants to say that. But the way that you ensure against that is to attach reward to the effort process. Because the dopamine molecule creates a sense of certainty, and you're not trying to create certainty about the final outcome. You're trying to create certainty only about the next outcome that's en route to the final outcome.
The next action outcome.
So you want to think about milestones.
Yes.
And so people set out with, I'm gonna write the great American novel, or I'm going to get the IPO. And of course, that's an important, you need to have a sense of what the finish line would actually look like. But the more that one can attach this subjective release of dopamine process to the intermediate steps through positive thinking and action, the higher that probability goes toward, in science we say there's a probability of 0 to 1. The higher that probability goes to 1, which is certainty. Now, everyone knows in the back of their mind that there is no absolute certainty. When I hear about, athletes or fighters, I was certain I was going to win, we all know that there's a 0.00000 doubt in everybody.
Right.
0.00, whatever that is. Now, for some people, they might be able to push that number way, way out. But certainty about outcome is actually a form of delusion. Certainty
it's
about
like a mania, yeah.
That's right. That's right. You see this in mania, and that's why people start engaging in behaviors that aren't good.
Fixated on this is going to happen.
That's right. The silver lining in this is that when you create certainty about outcomes, you can control. You take over this neurobiological system, and you create almost certainty that you will complete the process to the end goal perfectly. Previously, I told you that it's great to foreshadow failure, that's a great way to get your system into a state of activation. I also told you that you want to set goals that are challenging but possible. And again, here I'm paraphrasing from the work of Emily Balcetis. I want to be very clear. There are a few other things that one can do in order to bias the likelihood that you will succeed in trying to achieve your goals. First of all, limit your options. Trying to pursue too many goals at once can definitely be counterproductive. Now, I realize that life is complicated. We all have multiple goals that we're trying to pursue. But if we have particular goals that are important to us, we have to be careful to not get distracted by other goals. And many people run into this problem. So setting 1 or 2 or maybe 3 major goals for a given year is going to be more than enough for most people and is actually going to be challenging for most people. Now, of course, we have daily goals and monthly goals and yearly goals. But if we have big, lofty goals, we need to be careful not to contaminate our mental space and our visual space with too many goals. And why do I say visual goals? Well, what various department stores and supermarkets have discovered is that the greater the number of things in our visual attention, the more that we can draw our attention and our goals off a line of pursuit. What does that mean? Well, let's think about it in the practical context. This has actually been done. Big department stores have figured out that if they stock their shelves chock-a-block with many, many options of food or clothing items or objects or anything like that, people simply buy more stuff. People are very prone to orienting their attention to whatever is in front of them. You put a lot of stuff in front of them, their attention drifts. You put fewer things in front of them, their attention is more narrow. In a later episode, we'll talk about designing a workspace that's optimized on the basis of this. It doesn't mean being in a room with nothing except just your desk and a computer. It doesn't have to be that sparse. But visual sparseness actually can help us orient our focus and our behavior. When we have a lot of things in our visual environment or a lot of things in our cognitive environment, it's the same thing. And so if you're going to try and pursue a fitness goal, a relationship goal, an academic goal, and a long-term life financial goal all at once, that's 4 things. And you're going to have to come up with systems that allow you to isolate those goals in a very rigid way.
I'm never going to argue that we can subjectively control all of our experience, because there's some things that just genuinely suck, right? And it's important to register those not so great events or terrible events, because they can drive us also. We can be driven from a place of anger, frustration, and revenge, or we can be driven from a place of love, gratitude, and etc. I'm not here to judge which one is better or worse, but the nervous system doesn't distinguish between them. So if you're the kind of person that needs to kind of budge yourself into something, great. If you're the kind of person that wants to do things from more of a warm, fuzzy feeling, that's fine too. What I will say is this: the ability to tap into this dopamine reward system, which is activated anytime you're in pursuit of something that's outside the boundaries of your skin and literally the boundaries of your body, as well as the reward system, the serotonin, oxytocin system, which is really about the things that are contained within your own body and immediate experience, things like gratitude and, touch and comfort and things like that with loved ones. The ability to tap into both is crucial. Now, you said something really important, which was, negative thoughts. What to do? I don't believe that it's very easy to suppress negative thoughts. However, when you realize that thoughts can be deliberately introduced, you can start replacing negative thoughts with new types of thoughts. So you can always add something in. But when people start to realize that thoughts are very much like physical actions of reaching and picking up a glass of water, or taking a jog around the block, or typing an email perfectly. This is something I sometimes do because I struggle to do the perfect email. Not all my emails are perfect, but when I do one, I make sure that I complete it and I think, okay, it's possible. It's not because the email being perfect is so important. It's because I want to remind myself that my thoughts and my actions are essentially the same. The nervous system can organize thoughts. So for somebody that's struggling, we have these examples like, oh, they were really back on their heels, or they were so depleted, no money, and all this stuff. What are they going to? We have so many examples like that. But in trying to make it actionable, it's really about saying, yep, that's all true. But I'm going to introduce a thought, which is, I made it through today. I made it through today, and that's actually worth celebrating at a micro level. So if you can give yourself dopamine rewards in small increments, right? You're not trying to celebrate that you made it through one day. Sometimes that's a huge feat, but most of the time, you just want to dose yourself with a little bit of that internal release of dopamine. You start rewarding incremental steps. And if there's anything that your listeners could take away from this whole thing about dopamine and reward schedules and being in movement, it's reward incremental steps, in particular, incremental steps that are about forward action. So maybe that's writing an email. Maybe that's that run around the block. Maybe that's something much grander for you. As you get better at things, right, the stairs get further and further away from one another because you've achieved more success. And so they tend to be, you have to take the rungs on the ladder further apart, so to speak. That's a time when you really need to implement not only the dopamine rewards, but also those serotonin and oxytocin rewards, et cetera. So to make it actionable, I would say, remember, don't spend so much time trying to suppress negative thoughts. If you need trauma therapy, pursue that with a professional. But if you have negative thoughts, just remember, I can also introduce positive thoughts. The same way I can control running around the block. Positive thoughts are the equivalent of forward physical action. And if you reward them internally, you buffer yourself against the quitting circuit, this norepinephrine circuit we were talking about before. You are building a stronger version of yourself completely between your own ears. And some people say, well, that's silly. It's like you're saying, oh, I'm going to jump up and down, reward myself for doing nothing. No, you're building the neural circuits that you can control self-reward. And in doing that, you can push through days and weeks of effort consistently. I don't mean necessarily all-nighters, but you can push and push and push.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. For 10 more amazing rules from John Assaraf, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Why is it that so many people set goals? They have dreams, they have aspirations, hopes, and yet they don't achieve the goals, dreams, hopes, aspirations that they have.